Okay, yes, we are still on chapter 1. No, we are not still on the first page.
Well, depends on your Bible.
What's that?
We're still on the first page of my Bible.
Well,
Yeah, we are.
well, not in mine.
Well, no, it's not in mine either if I count the index and the preface. And
All right. Well, as I recall, we left off at verse 8, and so we're going to pick up with verse 9, which is the third day. So we've covered in what, a week and a half, 2 days worth of creation. So while a day is as 1,000 years, as 1,000 years is 1 day with God, with us, a day is as about a week.
A day is sort of irrelevant.
All right, anyway, verse 9 is where we're going to pick up. And I plan to get through at least a couple, if not, thank you, about 3 days worth of creation today.
okay.
All right, verse 9. Then God said, "Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. Now, you'll recall what we noticed in the second day of creation is that our planet at that point was this large mass of water. We don't, the Bible doesn't tell us what the core of the planet was like at the time. I mean, we can assume that it still had, an iron core such as what it has now. But as far as the surface of the planet, certainly nothing but water. And the second day of creation, we saw that God separated the water vertically. Put a large firmament above the atmosphere. Then there was water below, and what we refer to, or the Bible calls the first heaven, in the middle. Well, now God has taken that, and that's where we are with verse 9. It says the waters below the heavens, that's what it's talking about. Not the firmament that was above, but this gigantic worldwide ocean that existed below on what was then the planet's surface. God is now separating it, and dry land is coming up. This would have been essentially the first continent. Now, the Bible is not specific on this. I mean, all we can say is what logisticians, and by that I mean logic people, not supply people, refer to as an argument from silence. In other words, it doesn't say that it didn't happen this way, but we can't prove that it did. And that is, most geologists agree that at some point, now of course they say millions of years ago, creationists will say about 6,000 years ago, that there was only one major continent. There were no other continents. Like right now we've got, 7?
Last time I checked.
Yep. Didn't have any of that. There was one continent. And the wording on this does support that. It says, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear, and it was so. Now, reason I say that the wording of this supports there only being one mass of land is if there were 2 or 3 or whatever, would it have described this as the waters being gathered into one place?
No.
There probably would be multiple places, which is what we see on the planet now. And so the scripture's wording does support that, but it doesn't prove it. Verse 10 says, "And God called the dry land earth." Now, that definition of the word earth is simply as earth as opposed to, earth versus water and air. Not earth as in the planet. And the gathering of the waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good. Now, this is the first time on the third day of creation that God has now declared what he has created good. Why do you suppose God didn't make a declaration of goodness after the first and second days?
Wasn't finished.
Good point. In that phase of creation, it wasn't finished yet. But now he has a planet with a complete atmosphere. There's water, and we've got dry land, and God has said that's a good thing. Now, there's a big theological issue with this that we need to tackle at this point. And again, we could make this same argument each time God declared creation good. A lot of, not only theologians, but a lot of cultists, a lot of people from other religions and what have you, all try to claim that what has come into being, of course, keeping in mind that not every person agrees with creation. And I don't say that they have they're part of this argument. I'm just simply saying that other groups try to claim that the earth is not good. The earth became tainted when Adam and Eve sinned. Up until that point, everything God put into place, God himself declared to be good. So other various religious groups and philosophical schools and what have you that try to claim that that physical life or the physical universe is inherently evil, that's true as a result of sin, but the way it was created, it was not created in sin. God made it very clear that what he created by God's own declaration was good. Now, why does that even matter to us? Fast forward to some of the things that we've read about in the New Testament, the Gospel of John, some of Paul's writings, where he dickered with a particular philosophical group, including some who claimed to be Christian, that were called Gnostics. And I've talked about Gnostics before. Everybody remember who those were, or do I need to mention, kind of give you a brief description again? Brief description?
Yeah.
All right, during the first century, there was it began in Greece. It was based on a Greek philosophy that everything of a physical nature was inherently evil. Now, the problem with that is that if you make the assumption that simply because something is physical as opposed to spiritual, that it's automatically evil. Well, when you're talking about the physical resurrection of Christ, and you're among those that have bought into the concept that if it's physical, it must be evil, guess what? There were some people during the first century who, although they claimed to be Christians and claimed to believe in Jesus, they were denying the resurrection. Because they thought if God were truly good, God would not have been resurrected in a physical body because, well, we know that anything physical is evil. There were even some who took that a step further and said that Christ never really came in the flesh to begin with, that it was all an illusion, because if God had come in the flesh and God was good, then God couldn't be in the flesh, or God wasn't good. That all came from this Greek school of Gnosticism. Let me spell that out because...
Kind of circular logic, though.
Well, that's what you get when you're talking about philosophy. That's one of the reasons Paul also said that philosophy was a dangerous thing. It's spelled with a G.
G-N?
G-N, just like
Okay.
a gnat. Gnosticism. It's based on a Greek word which means, or gnosko, which in the Greek that means, am I back far enough? That means knowledge. The Gnostics believed that salvation was to be had not through a relationship with Christ, but through additional knowledge. The more you knew, the safer, spiritually wise, that you were. They denied the resurrection and in some cases the incarnation of Christ. And that's how some of these, what are called,
Agnostic?
what's that?
Agnostic?
Oh no, agnosticism is something totally different. I'm trying to think of the word. Mystery religions. That's how these mystery religions got started. Now, a mystery religion is basically a cult that takes you through a series of initiations, and with each initiation, you are given additional spiritual knowledge, and that you gain your salvation by learning more. The more knowledge you have, the more spiritual you are. Well, both Paul and John both condemned Gnosticism because they said that their whole worldview on everything physical being evil from the beginning was wrong. That's why for us, when we compare this with what John and Paul tells us in the New Testament, it is important. It would seem to be a very insignificant statement that God would declare his physical creation good. I'm here to tell you, folks, that back in the first century, Paul and many of the other apostles had fights over that. I don't mean physical fights, but theological fights over this, of those that denied that creation was good. You recall Paul said that there were some that had snuck into the church unawares and were teaching a different gospel. Guess who he was talking about? Gnosticism. And that's why this one little statement here that God said that it was good is actually a very important statement when you consider that. And by the way, it may have risen its head during the first century. It hadn't gone away. There's a lot of religions and various schools of philosophy in the world today that still adhere to this and deny that anything of the physical realm is good. Why do you think that Buddhists, for example, in Buddhism, the whole goal is to simply become so enlightened that you simply cease to exist in the physical world? In Hinduism, that believes in, Hinduism and Buddhism both do, but in Hinduism, they believe in reincarnation and worship a multitude of different gods. But for them, and this is where the term karma comes from, that if your karma is good enough, you will eventually stop the cycle of reincarnation and eventually simply leave the physical world. Where do they get these ideas from? It's all, goes back to Gnosticism. For us as Christians, if we deny that the physical world is good and we buy into it's inherently evil, then not only would we have to deny the resurrection of Christ, but guess who else's resurrection we would have to deny?
Us.
Our own. Absolutely. So now, finish this up. Yes, we realize that the physical world now, as well as the spiritual world, does have sin in it. It has been tainted. But one of the promises that we've been given, and we saw that at the end of our study of Revelation, is that the time will come that God will do away with this creation and start over with, again, a physical creation, a physical universe that has not been tainted by sin.
Okay.
All right. Verse 11. Keep in mind, we are still on the third day of creation. Then God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them on the earth," and it was so. So what you have there is the creation of all kinds of fruit, and it says plants yielding seed. Anybody want to know what that is?
Plant.
Well, not just plants,
Reproduction.
vegetables. It's another way of describing a vegetable.
Don't fruits bear seed?
Yes, but it specifically points out that these are fruit trees bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them.
Oh, okay.
Because the herbs have their own, that's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay.
All right, and verse 12 says, "And the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind." And notice here, verse 12, "And God saw that it was good." So twice on the third day of creation, God has declared that it was good. First, when he creates dry land, and then immediately after creating the dry land, he brings forth vegetation.
Quick question. Isn't that sort of way it says, it sort of throws a wrench in evolution also, because it says of its kind.
Yep. Now, keep in mind, let me finish this one quick verse here, then I'm going to tackle that. Verse 13 says, "There was evening and there was morning, a third day." Once again, notice that the day is defined as not a, day and night, but evening and then morning. That constitutes a day. We're now at the end of the third day of creation, and God's done two things. Brought forth dry land and put vegetation on it. Now, to this issue of bringing things after their own kind, and we will see this again when God creates the animal life on the sixth day. Well, not all animal life, but land animals, I should say, because the fifth day of creation, God also created. The fourth, fifth, and sixth day, God has created animal life. Different kind on each day. But on each day, there's total of 4 days out of this. The third, fourth, fifth, and sixth day, God created some kind of life on each of these, beginning with plant life. With each one, it says that it was created after their kind. Now, that does not mean that every single species of animal and plant that exists today was had a separate act of creation for. The term kind, well, how many of you remember from your high school biology, and I realize that might have been a few months ago, maybe 2 or 3 semesters ago. How many remember the difference between a genus and a species? Blank looks on everybody else.
Yeah, similarities in its exact.
All right, a species is one specific type of animal. For example, a house cat, Felis domesticus. That's one species. Felis is the name of the genus. Consider it a classification. For example, as we are all sitting here, and I realize that you ladies are probably going to think, yeah, I thought that those men were a completely different species. Some of us in here are men, some are women, but we all have what in common?
DNA.
Well, we're all.
We got DNA in common with,
Homo sapiens.
Species.
what's that?
Species.
Well, that, yes, but we're all people, aren't we?
Well,
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if you said that, there's a person, you're still left with, okay, there's 2 different kinds of people. You got males and you got females. Unfortunately, now according to Trump, the federal government's now stuck with that reality. By the way, for those of you that are asking, asked me yesterday or the day before, some of the things that Trump had issued executive orders on, that's one of the things he did right off the bat, was to declare that from now on, the federal government could only recognize two genders, male and female. That's another story. But anyway, that's sort of the way it is with a genus and a species. A species, I use the cat as an example. Felis domesticus is a domestic house cat. That's the domesticus part, obviously. But one step above that, the felis part, in other words, we get the word feline from that.
Right.
There's more than one kind of cat out there besides just a house cat, isn't there?
Yeah.
There's like the African sand cat, which only grows to be about this big. They're smaller than a domestic house cat. They can, in fact, interbreed with a domestic house cat, but they're wild cats, and they only get about this big. There's the European forest cat, even smaller than that. They would be considered a miniature cat to what we would think of as a cat. But guess what? They can still interbreed with a domestic house cat. So you've got a whole laundry list of different types of cats that are recognized as a specific individual type of cat. But guess what? They're all still cats, aren't they?
So still feline?
All still felines.
Okay.
Now, that's what this is talking about when it says they all reproduced after their own kind. Some people have asked, well, how in the world could Noah, or God for that matter, have gotten that many different species of animals on that ark? First off, keep in mind the ark was a whole lot bigger than most people think it was. If you actually do take the measurements the Bible gives us, the ark was a big boat. But even then, it would be physically impossible to get every single species of known animal on to that ark. You know, a male and a female. And then of the clean animals, a lot of the times we overlook this. There were some of those animals that was more than just, 2 of them. There were 7 of the ones that were clean. Why did God tell Noah to take extras of the clean animals? What's that? That's exactly what it was for, because then when it was over and done with, Noah had something to sacrifice. As well as God told Noah when the waters receded and the plant life had basically been flooded out, Noah at least had something to eat between then and the time that stuff started to resprout, which would have taken a few months. I mean, you take a fruit tree, even if a fruit trees began to sprout, how long does it take the average fruit tree to actually start producing fruit? And even vegetables, which would have been available for him, might have still taken, 3 or 4 months at best. So God provided for Noah and his family by telling him to take extras of those that were considered clean animals. And he even told Noah afterward that those would in fact be food for him. So and we'll look at this more later on when we get to that. I think it's in the 6th chapter. But for those who are, dyed-in-the-wool vegetarians, or even worse, vegans, you say, oh, how dare you? Guess what? God told us that those animals were acceptable as food. But that's another story. But the point is, you couldn't get all of those different types of animals onto the ark. But guess what? You could get one male and female cat on there, and then over a period of a few years, guess what happens when, cats breed and they separate and they, a couple of cats go this way and a couple of cats go that way. What happens about, 50 or 100 years later?
They adapt to the environment.
They tend to adapt to their environment. They develop different characteristics. They're still cats, but now they no longer, necessarily look alike. They may be different colors, maybe a different shape. I mean, look at a dog, for example. It is common knowledge that every canine all descended from what?
Wolf.
A wolf. You know how big a wolf is? Wolf stands up about that tall.
But isn't that how some evolutionists use that as their
They do.
excuse?
Evolutionists try to say that, well, look at here, this proves that evolution happened. There's only one big problem with that.
doesn't keep
that
happening.
wolf and dog can still interbreed. Now, they may not get along because they have a natural tendency, once their characteristics begin to separate. It has also been noticed in research over the last few decades that as animals do diverge, they tend not to get along and they intentionally separate themselves. For example, leopards and, there's an animal up in the Himalayas called a snow leopard, and we have panthers, leopards, and what have you. They're all basically the same animal, and they can interbreed. But you put a snow leopard together with, say, an African leopard in the same room, guess what they're going to do?
Fight.
They're going to fight unless the female is in heat and, she's ready to breed, in which case they get over their fighting tendencies. But in most cases, they want to separate, and that's natural. I think God bred that or created that into them to cause the animals, just like he did to us at the Tower of Babel, to force us to spread out. But they're still big cats. And that's the problem with the evolutionists. You take a wolf, yes, people have been able to breed different types of dogs from that wolf. By the way, any of you ever seen a Siberian Husky?
Yep.
You know how much like a wolf that booger looks like? Very much like a wolf. They're slightly smaller than a wolf, and obviously they've been domesticated. They're much friendlier than a wolf, but again, that's because of years of domestication. But they're still capable of interbreeding with that wolf. It's still the same species. Now, biologists, give them two different biological names, but as far as their ability to breed, same animal. So when it says after their kind, God only had to put, maybe a couple of wolves or a couple of cats, and maybe, a couple of big cats, maybe a couple of the medium-sized cats. There are different types of cats. I'm sure that you're not going to convince me that a lion and a domestic cat both, came from the same animal, but certainly, probably the big cats as a whole probably came from the same animal. Just like small cats. You take a bobcat. A bobcat's about that big. We think, oh, that bobcat, that's so big, he couldn't possibly, have come from the same source as a domestic cat. Yeah, but have you ever seen a Maine Coon?
Yes.
Maine Coon is a domestic cat that's as big as a bobcat. Maine Coons are big boogers. Our younger son's been dying to get his hands on a Maine Coon, but I don't think he really realizes how big that cat is. He's a big booger. But bobcats and domestic cats can successfully interbreed.
Just what men did with dogs. Old breeds of dogs, they bred dogs together. Within a few generations, they lose the identity of the two mating dogs, and they become their own species.
They become their own thing.
Yep.
So anyway, the point here is that when it says after their kind, does not necessarily mean exactly what we consider the same species, but cats will produce cats, dogs will produce dogs, elephants are going to produce elephants. But the elephant's another good example where, one kind, but possibly 3 or 4 different species. What's the difference between an elephant, a mammoth, and a mastodon? We know mammoths and mastodons are extinct today, but we've got enough archaeological evidence, we pretty well know what they look like. You know what the difference between a mastodon, a mammoth, and an elephant is?
The size.
What's that?
The size.
One's a little bit, the mastodon and the mammoth are larger and they're hairy. An elephant, for example, does have, we see pictures of them, and maybe you've seen one in the zoo and you think it's just no hair on it, but you get up close to an elephant does have hair, it's just very fine and short. You take that same animal and you breed one that would produce long hair, guess what you'd have? A mammoth.
Well, and it would be, then it would be talking about climates,
Mm-hmm.
because they'd have to have longer, heavier, shaggier hair to keep them warm than.
Well, and that's a good example. We know that after the flood, the world recovering from the effects of the flood, the world went into an ice age for a few hundred years. What would happen to all the elephants that lived up in the far northern and far southern latitudes that are now subjected to, consistent freezing temperatures? And we all know that an elephant, while it does have hair, doesn't have a lot. It does not have what we would consider a winter coat. What would happen to them?
They die.
They'd die. But guess what would happen to the mammoths and the mastodons?
They-
They'd flourish. The opposite would happen is once the ice age went away and the ice receded, then all those mammoths and what have you that were living, say, in the northern, what is now the northern United States, well, then once it started warming up, you take an animal that's got a thick winter coat that has one like that year round, what's going to happen when the temperature hits 100 degrees?
They're gonna
He's
be-
going to die out. So that's one of the ways God has orchestrated it to cause, to produce diversity in the animal and yes, in the plant kingdom as well, but still produce one kind. So, anyway, my whole point is in that, and yes, after their kind, it's not going to be evolution where one species completely produces some, a bird. A reptile's not going to produce a bird. But you might see, some diversity within a particular kind. Last one I'll use an example, then we'll move on. Here in Florida, what is Florida known for reptile-wise besides snakes?
Gators.
Gators. What's the difference between an alligator, a crocodile, a Nile crocodile, and what's the one that's seems like it starts with a C or something? That's Cayman.
Yeah.
The Cayman down in South America, and they're all the same animal, but have just because of their physical isolation over the generations, have developed their own specific, just like we as people. Some people got, dark skin, some got light skin, some got big noses, some got little noses. Well, alligators got a wider snout than a crocodile. Crocodiles grow a little bit longer. The other thing here in Florida, we have manatees. What's the difference between a manatee and what's over there in the Mediterranean? There's some,
Sea cow.
what's that?
Sea cow.
Sea cow. Thank you. You ever seen a picture of a sea cow? They look just like manatees. There's only one big difference in them. A manatee's got a solid, back fluke. A sea cow's fluke has separated. Same animal, just one little different point there. African and Indian elephants. They're both elephants. One just got bigger ears than the other.
I find interesting is manatees are closely related to elephants. Not saying, but it's interesting how the creation goes across. Use different parts and pieces. They're still different, but I just
Well,
found
you
that
figured
very interesting.
if God decided He had a good idea, why should He come up with a different idea for every different thing?
Absolutely. Duck-billed platypus. I know where he came up with that one.
I think God, I see.
Yeah.
I think the duck-billed platypus is God's sense of humor, just saying, "Watch this." And for those of you that don't know, a duck-billed platypus is considered a mammal because it does produce a type of milk, but duck-billed platypus does not have breasts. It has these little glands that just produce a milk-like fluid that the babies lick off the mother's fur. It's got a bill on it like a duck, and it lays eggs. But because it produces milk, they call it a mammal. And the other thing about it is the male duck-billed platypus is actually venomous. When you try to say, okay, is this a mammal? Is it a reptile? Is it a bird? Is it a duck? The answer is kind of a little bit of all of it. And you got to think that this just proves to me that not evolution, but that God's got a sense of humor.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, well, I'm probably getting ahead of myself because the waters, the salt versus fresh water,
Uh-huh.
where did that come into being? Because the manatees are river and freshwater dwellers, aren't they? Can they do seawater? I don't
Yeah,
know.
Yeah,
That's-
manatees go back and forth.
okay. What about crocodiles and alligators?
They can. Alligators don't like salt water, but they can live in it.
Oh, okay.
I mean, in the Everglades, they have adapted.
Well, I know we've got brackish water, you know,
See,
different places.
That's one of the things, even so-called saltwater fish. If you change the salinity of the salt water very slowly, or going in the other direction, take a freshwater fish, add salt very slowly, not just, and when I say slowly, I don't mean a few hours, I'm
Yeah.
talking about maybe change the salinity over a few days or a few weeks.
Yeah.
That freshwater fish will adapt to that salt water, and
Okay.
vice versa.
Okay. I did not know that. That's why I wanted to ask, because, yeah. Thank you.
All right, let's see. We have time to. All right, that was day 3. Let's see, how far is day 4 here? We're gonna get through that. Let's go ahead. I don't think it's gonna, unless we have some more questions. I think we can cover the 4th day here in just a few minutes, and we'll call it quits for the night. Verse 14. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth." And it was so. Notice here, God has already created night and day by producing light, which He Himself would have manifested. This tells us the earth has now started spinning in space. But at this point, up until day 4 of creation, the earth is out there in the universe all by itself. There isn't even a moon yet. He's produced plants that have no light from the sun. The light from for the plants and what have you is coming from God Himself at this point. Also, in verse 14, notice it says, "And let them be for signs and for seasons." All right, well, see, the seasons is pretty obvious. We can tell what season it is, not just by how cold it is, but how long the day and nights are, and also by watching the constellations. By observing which constellation is coming across the sky, we know what season or what month of the year it is. But also notice it said they are for signs. Now the Bible expressly prohibits astrology. It says astrology is of the devil. It is forbidden of God's people in Deuteronomy. But notice that God still said that the stars were given to us for certain signs. And we see that manifested. For example, how did the 3 wise men know that a king had been born?
By the star.
They knew how to interpret the signs in the sky. It was not astrology. Folks, not all astrological, that's not the word, astronomical, excuse me, that's the correct word. Not all astronomical phenomena is astrology. Some of those things God put in the sky for specific signs for us. The question is, do we look at it as a sign of an event or a season, or are we looking at it to determine the direction of our lives? If we start letting our lives be determined by what star is in the sky or the direction or what planets are lined up, then we have crossed the line from astronomy to astrology, and that's what the Bible forbids. But at this point, beginning in the 4th day, is when God has created a separate body in the heavens to produce light instead of the light of God Himself. Verse 16 says, "And God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day, the lesser light to govern the night. The stars also," by the way, in my translation, which is a New American Standard, it says, "He made the stars also." And that the "He made" is in italics, which tells us what?
Was added for clarity.
Added for clarity. What it literally states, and I did look this up in the Hebrew, it just says the lesser light to govern the night, the stars also. To add the stuff in there that he made the stars also, that's an interpretation. I think what it actually is stating is that the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light and the stars to govern the night. I think that's what that's actually stating. So the lesser light to govern the night along with the stars also. And God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth. At that point, that's when God, not to say God created the universe was already created, but that's when it's at verse 17 that God has now populated the universe. By population, not us, but populated it with
Other
stars and
moons.
and other and planets and things of that. Verse 18, to govern the day and the night and to separate the light from the darkness. Notice, here we go, number 3. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, a 4th day. Now, I want to stop there. But I'm going to share something with you on Sunday on verse 17 as far as God placing stuff in the expanse of the heavens. I'll give you just a little teaser at this point. Does anybody know, based on current scientific evidence, not biblical evidence at this point, the Bible doesn't really tell us, but on scientific evidence, how far apart based upon current knowledge? And I stress current knowledge because what happens every year or two?
It changes.
Yeah, we get more knowledge. But on current knowledge, how far from one end to the other do astrophysicists and astronomers think, how big do they think that the, again, to use my term, populated universe is?
Really, 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 really big.
Thank you, that was rare scientific.
Billions of.
About 40 billion light years across.
Yeah.
From the farthest star over here to the farthest star over here, about 40 billion light years. How long do they think, if you're looking at it from the perspective of evolution, how long do they think, or should say, how old do they think the universe is?
Really, 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 really long. Millions of
Old
years
with
old.
really big letters.
No, that's millions and millions of years.
Oh, it would be more than that, because if we're talking about billion light years, we're talking
That's
about
the whole point.
yeah.
Is that currently they're trying to claim that the universe is bigger than the amount of time they claim that the earth has even been in existence. So the big question that leaves us is, if light travels at approximately 186,000 miles per second, how is it that we're even able to see stars that are farther away from us than they think the universe has been in existence?
Well, I'm going to say they don't take God into account.
That's true. But then even when we take God into account, if the earth is only about 6,000 years old, how is it that today we are seeing stars that, even whether you believe in evolution or not, we do know that they are millions and in some cases billions of light years away from us? So how are we able to see them if the earth has only been here for 6,000 years?
Because God lets us.
Well, that's true, but that's what we're going to
I
look at on
think-
Sunday evening.
Yeah, I think somebody got their information wrong.
It wasn't God.
Yeah.
But that's
Because
just that's a
that-
teaser for Sherry to go home and stew over.
Not what is it? Not Gnosticism.
Gnosticism.
Gnosticism. They got it wrong.
Oh, okay. Among other things.
Well, all that knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll look at that, and then we'll pick up with day 5 of